Hey y'all, welcome and welcome back. So as you would have seen by the title of the video today, I want to talk about tragedy, which sounds weird, but I promise I'm going somewhere with this. So we're going to be talking about specifically Gen 1 of Monster High, because Monster High is inherently kind of more horrific than other doll brands, and like that is the point. Like the point is that they are more alternative, more like edgy, not always like out and out goth. Like that's a whole separate discourse we're not going to get into. But compared to other brands, they do tend to have darker aesthetics or more alternative aesthetics. And also, the characters are all monsters, which, like, in and of itself is just kind of a darker concept than, like, Barbie, for example. And that's great and wonderful and beautiful. But some of that does mean that it can get exceptionally dark at times. And that is what fascinates me. And I've been thinking about this for a while. And today is just like the video culmination of me thinking about things for too long, essentially. So, yeah, I want to talk about what I think are the most tragic characters of Gen 1 of Monster High. I am specifying Gen 1, first of all, because, at least to my opinion, none of the G3 characters have backstories that are like wildly tragic in comparison to the characters from G1. And also because, correct me if I'm wrong, please, but I'm pretty sure I saw somewhere that some of the more horrific elements of Monster High as a brand, or like the horrific implications, have intentionally been removed from G3 within like the context that I feel like it was like a tweet or something. Please let me know if you know what I'm talking about or if I'm just absolutely bonkers. But I think I remember someone saying that, like someone who works on the Monster High team, saying that in G3, ghosts are like a species rather than a human who has died and is now a ghost. So, like, they were born a ghost, they'll always be a ghost. And that kind of removes some of the horror of, like, oh gosh, this used to be a person and this is what they've turned into. So, I think that that is what G3 is going with, is like, monsters are just different species, and if they're like undead or dead or whatever, they're born that way and like they're supposed to be that way rather than it being something that happened to a human person. Again, please tell me if I'm wrong, but like I'm pretty sure I'm right. But G1 definitely did not have that. In fact, some characters, like, explicitly within their backstories and like the diaries and everything, all the information that we get on them, some of them explicitly used to be human, and that is just like, it's so much more horrific to me. And because of that, it's kind of more interesting to me. I like dark topics, they're just fascinating. So, yeah, today I wanted to compile a list of what I think are the top 5 most tragic backstories that characters from Gen 1 of Monster High have. I actually didn't intend for this to be like a top 5, 10, whatever video. But after I went through and like read all about the characters to refresh my memory on everyone's backstory, I happen to have 5 characters that stood out to me. So I figured at that point I might as well just rank them least to most tragic and make it kind of a top 5 video. I don't know. Again, not what I planned, but this is where we are. So that's what we're doing today. Hopefully this will be interesting for you guys, because it's definitely a very interesting topic to me. Kind of dark, but like dark and interesting can go together. So yeah, if you do find yourself enjoying, if you could like, comment, subscribe, all of that fun stuff. I also have my Amazon wishlist and my PO box in the description down below if you want to go out of your way to support me. But without further ado, let's start discussing some rough character backstories. Before we get into it, I actually should just give a quick warning for spoilers. I feel like that's kind of obvious because like I'm talking character backstory, so I'm obviously spoiling the backstories. Some of that is going to be spoiling like bits and pieces of movies and webisodes, but less so that. Just in case though, I did want to say that so that just in case you guys are like on the lookout for that, maybe don't watch this video. But yeah, we're going to be starting out at my least tragic backstory for the list and then working our way up to the top, which means that we are starting out with Elizabeth. So Elizabeth is a Gen 1 Monster High character who is a vampire. When she was young, her parents mysteriously disappeared, leaving her in the care of her uncle, Lord Stoker, which like should be fine, except Lord Stoker was not a super chill guy. And when it turned out that the like vampire gem, it's the vampire heart. I cannot believe I just said the vampire gem. The vampire heart, which decides who the next vampire queen is going to be, decides that Elizabeth is destined to be the next vampire queen. Lord Stoker is thrilled because he's like, super, I can manipulate my niece and I can get her to do exactly what I want, which again, spoiler alert, is not super great for monsters in general. Like, he's just not a great guy. So Elizabeth is forced to flee to another country, another continent actually, and basically take up a secret identity and pretend to be someone she isn't to hide the vampire heart and to try to protect it and herself from Lord Stoker's evil intentions. Now, the reason Elizabeth is at number 5 for me is because I definitely do think that there is something inherently tragic about feeling like you are forced to run away from everything that you've ever known, some things that you love very, very dearly, and have to like start a whole new life, especially at a relatively young age. Like that is quite difficult. And then there is the whole issue of Elizabeth's parents just mysteriously disappearing, which mysteriously disappearing is never a good word, like never a good phrase, right? You never want to hear that, especially in context of your parents. Like that doesn't sound great. But the reason that she's not higher up on this list is for a couple of reasons. First of all, she was like forced to flee in the sense that Elizabeth felt like that was her best option because she did not feel strong enough internally to stand up to her uncle. But like also she could have like tried to lean on friends or like gain help to not let him manipulate her. Like she had another option, I guess is the best way to put it. Not that I'm saying it was an easy option. Like I'm not trying to judge my girl. I'm just saying she did technically have another option. But the bigger thing that keeps this from being like a huge, huge tragedy to me is that she ends up being an actress in Hauntlywood, and it seems like she really, really loves it. So while Elizabeth did kind of feel like she had to go undercover and run away, I feel like the life that she built for herself while she was like ran away, that's not how to put that. Y'all know what I mean. I feel like the new life she built for herself was one that she genuinely loved and like found enjoyment in and found fulfillment in. So while there are some tragic elements there, I do feel like her story ultimately has quite a happy ending, or like I guess middle, because she's still alive. Like it's not the end of her story. But I feel like there are some happy elements to it, so it takes it down a notch from being like as tragic as some of the others on this list. The next character I wanted to talk about is Gigi Grant. So Gigi is a genie, and I do feel like her backstory is like slightly more vague than some of the other characters that we're talking about. Definitely not the vaguest out of all the Monster High characters' backstories, because like honestly, a lot of them don't even have backstories in G1. They just kind of exist in the present. But Gigi doesn't have like a very specific timeline or anything like that. So it is a little bit more vague, but we do know that as a genie, she was stuck in her lamp all by herself for an indeterminate amount of time, but like definitely a very long period of time. And isolation is just, it's very hard for humans. So I'm going to assume that it's very hard for monsters. Like long-term isolation has really, really bad effects on people, and it's just very hard for people to deal with. And so I'm assuming that Gigi was not having a good time while she was stuck in that lamp by herself. But what really takes it to the next level is that if I'm remembering correctly, because sometimes the Monster High facts are hard to remember for me because I don't know, my brain is just like, nah, you don't need that information. I want to say that one of the finders of her lamp wished Wisp into existence and like basically turned, I think it was Gigi's shadow, into Wisp and into like this friend that she could have in the lamp. And so you'd think that would be a good thing. That would be like some company, so Gigi's no longer alone. But Wisp slowly becomes more and more resentful and ends up turning into Gigi's like enemy. I tried to say nemesis and enemy at the same time, but she turns into an enemy for Gigi. So imagine going from extreme isolation for years and years and years and years on end with only the occasional finder to give you any sort of company, and then you finally have a friend, only for, as the years continue to go on, that friend to become someone who like despises you, who cannot stand to be around you, who is like preying on your downfall and all of that. That is so heartbreaking. Like the isolation alone is really, really bad. But then to watch your friend turn into someone that you don't recognize and who doesn't care about you anymore, that is a rough thing to go through. And honestly, I think that the reason Gigi is at like the 4th spot for me, is just because I do think that the other characters that I have to talk about are a little bit more tragic. But also, I feel like Gigi makes some questionable choices. Like I feel like sometimes the ways that she fulfills wishes are not the best, and also just the way she interacts with characters doesn't always make sense to me. So I have a little bit of beef with Gigi, specifically for turning Laguna into a freshwater monster, because I think that was wild of her to do. But I can still recognize that Gigi's past was not ideal, so she had to be on the list here. The next character I want to talk about is Draculaura, and I do think, just like as a side effect of being kind of a more main character, Draculaura's backstory has a lot more detail, so there's a little bit more to cover. But Draculaura was one of the characters that was born human. She was born to human parents in Rome in 412 AD. Her father was a friend, or like acquaintance. It is kind of unclear how close they were, but he knew Dracula. And so when that father tragically died, Dracula took in her and her mother Carmilla and like basically gave them shelter and was providing them with a nice life in Transylvania. Dracula did fall in love with her mother, and for a while everything was fine and dandy until Dracula went away on a trip, and while he was gone, of course, plague struck. Carmilla did die of plague, and so Dracula returned only to find that his lover, I don't know if they were married, so I'm just going to say lover. His lover had passed away, and not only that, but also his child, basically, like his adopted child, Draculaura, was sick with plague, so he was forced to turn her into a vampire in order to save her life. So this is kind of like Elizabeth in the sense that it does technically have like kind of a happy ending. I mean, Draculaura didn't die. She still has a father, and like we know that her life at Monster High is pretty happy. You know, she has friends and a boyfriend and all of these things. So it's not inherently terrible at the end, but I just feel like it's so sad to, as a baby, lose your father to then find happiness again with like this newfound family with your biological mom and kind of your adopted dad, and they fall in love and everything's wonderful. And then your mom dies and then you get super sick, and then you have to go from being a human to adjusting to this new life of being a vampire. And like, probably Draculaura didn't care so much about being a vampire because Dracula was one. So like she was already familiar with it, right? Like it's not inherently strange to her. But that's still a lot to give up. Like to acknowledge the passing of your human life, I feel like has to be really weird to deal with. Like that's just something I don't think is always touched upon enough in stories like this, where it's like they were human and now they have to adjust to this idea of living essentially forever. Like immortality sounds so cool, but then you realize that people around you are just going to be dying and like things around you are going to decay. It's kind of crazy. And so I do feel like even though Draculaura has kind of a happy ending as we see it, like the end of the story that we're told, that is not like a good beginning to her life. Like there's a lot of turmoil in there, there's a lot of loss in there, and a lot of tragedy in there. So I did want to include her on this list. Next up is another very detailed entry, and one that I think is so rough. We are talking about Cleo Denial here. So much like Draculaura, she was born as a human. She was born in ancient Egypt as a princess, with her father being the pharaoh, and she lived a pretty charmed life. You know, like she's a princess in the royal family. She also is not the like firstborn. That would be Nephra. So while it is kind of like maybe a bummer depending on your personality type to know that you're not going to get to lead your country, it also definitely is like less pressure on you, right? Knowing that you're not going to have to uphold all of that. However, did not stay charmed for long because her father ended up not being the most popular, and so a coup was arranged. Some advisors who ended up betraying them did take Cleo, Nephra, and her father to what was supposed to be a safe house, and they wrapped them in these magical bandages while being told that like, hey, these bandages are just going to keep you like healthy and safe basically until the coup is over and until we can get you out and restore you to your rightful place on the throne. But they were being lied to. The bandages actually were magic bandages that put them to sleep for, I want to say, 1,300 years. And like the people who were putting them in this safe house were part of the coup. They were basically just trying to get the pharaoh and his children out of the way, which is not super. Now, like I said, they slept for 1,300 years, but then they did end up waking up. And so like that in itself is wild. Like you go to sleep and then you wake up and it's 1,300 years later. But it actually gets so much worse because at this point, they have made the transformation from human to monster, right? So again, much like Draculaura, this is something where they have to cope with the loss of their humanity and be like, oh, now I have to keep these bandages on because if I take them off, I'm going to turn to dust because I was supposed to realistically die about 1,300 years ago. But even worse than that to me is we also get something kind of similar to Gigi's backstory in play here, where they are isolated. Not completely. We're talking about Cleo specifically. She obviously has her father and Nephra, but they are stuck in this like safe house. That's just the best word for me to use, so I'm not going to keep it in the quotations. They are stuck in this safe house for another 4,500 years. Over 4,000 more years. That is so much. And like, while it isn't the direct isolation that Gigi had for much of her life, I honestly think it could be worse because we see in the webisodes and the movies and everything that Nephra and her father are not kind to Cleo. Like they aren't good to her. They aren't nurturing and loving and all of that. Also, during all this, they were separated from the mom. So like Cleo just doesn't know where her mother is during all of this, which is in and of itself another tragedy. Like that's crazy. But imagine being stuck for 4,500 years, like obviously there was a 1,300 asleep, but like the 4,500 years awake with two people who constantly think that you're doing things wrong and that you're not good enough, and just like all of that toxic energy, and you're just stuck in this relatively small space with them. You can't get away from it, and they're the only interaction that you have. That is absolutely horrific. Eventually they do get free of the safe house, which like is good. There is kind of another upswing at the end of this story. But again, at that point, I just feel like it has to be so jarring to go into this safe house as a human, like in the times of ancient Egypt, and then wake up and it's modern times and you're now a monster. And you have to reintegrate with a society that has moved on so far past like what you knew, and like everything that you knew is genuinely ancient history at that point. And then also you basically have to re-enter a completely new society because you can't interact with humans normally anymore because you're no longer one of them. That's so much for Cleo. Like I have said, especially in recent videos after having watched all of the Monster High media, that I'm not the biggest fan of Cleo's personality, and I still hold by that. But just because I'm not a huge fan of her personality doesn't mean that I can't see that she went through some shit, and that doesn't mean that I can't feel bad for her, because like that's a really rough backstory. Arguably, it should be number one, maybe, like depending on who you talk to, but I'm extremely biased, so for me, the number one most tragic character in Gen 1 of Monster High has got to be Hoodoo. And I know some of y'all are probably sick of me talking about him, but listen, Hoodoo is my favorite character. I just think he's interesting and very sympathetic. I also think that he's really funny. I just really like him as a character. So there is some bias at play here, but also I do think he does genuinely have an extremely tragic backstory. Hoodoo was created by Frankie with the express purpose of being her boyfriend. Like that was the only thing she had in mind, was like, oh, I need a boyfriend, I'm going to create him. So first of all, created by someone who is also brand new to this world, like less than 3 weeks old at this point, I believe. So extremely new to being alive, and then suddenly, boom, you're creating another monster. That's already really rough because you don't have any guidance at that point, right? Like, what are you supposed to do? Like, you don't have real parents. You just have the person who created you, but they also were recently created and they're also trying to figure everything out. And also, they want you to date them, which that's like a whole separate issue. That's also just kind of weird. But Frankie pretty much immediately just tosses Hoodoo aside and is like, yeah, this is not going to work out. This is not what I thought it would be. Like, I actually don't want to do this. So Hoodoo's express purpose for being created was to love Frankie. That was all that he was supposed to do. And then Frankie just rejects him and is like, have fun. Sorry, bud. Can't help you anymore. Also, they like never interact on screen after this. Like they might have a few one-liners with each other, but like they genuinely do not interact with each other, which is just crazy to me that Frankie creates a whole monster and then it's just like someone else will probably take care of him. So that in and of itself is really, really tragic. But there's also the fact of Hoodoo being a voodoo doll. So he is shown in the series to not be able to experience pain. Any like painful thing that happens to him, the pain is felt by someone else near him. So this next part is just like my theory, my extrapolation. Maybe because I like this character, I'm just trying to inject a little extra punch into his tragic backstory. But I also don't think that it's like wild to say he probably can't feel good touch either. Like if someone were to give him a hug, if he can't feel himself tripping and falling down, I feel like he also probably couldn't feel a hug, if that makes sense. Like I don't know. Again, I could be wrong. This is not confirmed whatsoever, but I don't feel like it's crazy to say that. And so even if it's not 100% true, just the thought of someone who is created explicitly to love and who has so much love in his heart, even as he learns to redirect that away from Frankie and to like try to become his own monster and redirect that love somewhere else. The idea of Hoodoo not being able to like feel physical affection when he was only created to be affectionate is genuinely so violently sad to me. Like, my poor guy. Again, I'm probably extremely biased. I also I like dark topics. I like tragedies and stuff like that, but especially when you sprinkle romance in there, that's really my kind of thing. So basically, this whole top entry could just be me being violently biased and making stuff up, but this is my video, so that's what I'm gonna do. So yeah, for me, Hoodoo is definitely the most tragic character in Gen 1 of Monster High, but obviously, y'all could disagree with me. You probably don't all have the same biases as I do. So I'd be very curious to hear who you think has the most tragic backstory in G1 of Monster High. Like, do you agree with this list? Do you think the most tragic characters at least on this list, or do you think I just missed them entirely? I'm very curious because, like, just in general, I think there's a lot of really like crazy backstories out there. I mean, every single ghost in Gen 1 was a person, which is in and of itself pretty horrific. So you could definitely include like Spectre on here and stuff like that. So yeah, I'm very curious to hear who you guys think has the most tragic backstory, but those were my thoughts for today. I am done rambling now. I hope you were able to enjoy the video. I hope you guys have a lovely rest of your day or your night or whatever it might be, and I will catch you on the next one. Bye guys.